Hello, and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy, podcast where two mental health professionals talk about their mental health journeys and how they navigate mental wellness while working in the mental health field. I'm your host, Jeremy Schumacher, licensed marriage and family therapist, and today I am joined by owner and operator of Natural Mind Counseling, David Hayden. David, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
I'm super stoked to talk to you. We have a lot of professional overlap, and there's a lot of things that you do in your practice that I think are really interesting from a professional lens that I don't think people talk about enough. So I'm excited to
Yes.
jump in and talk with you. First question I always start with is, how'd you get into the mental health field?
Yeah, that's a great question. Honestly, I think my journey towards the mental health field started when I was probably about 12 or so. And I remember going on this walk and having this very clear, vivid experience of really wanting to be with people in their pain and their stories. And then I think life kind of unfolded with that too. Kind of, you take a class and you have a conversation with somebody, and then you have another experience of someone really listening to you in a deep and empathic way, and it just kind of unfolds from there too. I was definitely the person in high school that a lot of people sought out to talk about things with, and
Yeah.
constantly had that experience throughout my life. And I think it really solidified for me in college, though, as part of my college education. We were offered a certain amount of sessions of free therapy, and that
Hmm.
was my first chance to like really drop in an individual way. And just getting to see another human being show up and like offer space in that, just set me up to know that this was the field that I really wanted to be in.
Yeah, that's so cool. What was going on, if you don't mind me asking,
Mhm.
at 12 years old, where you were like, hey, I want to witness or I want to hold space for people while they're going through this?
Yeah, I mean, I think reflecting back on that time and then also doing a lot of parts work in my own life, uh, that 12-year-old felt pretty alone and lonely, and
Hmm.
didn't really have people in his life that were asking the questions of him that helped him feel seen and heard in the ways that he needed to. And
Hmm.
not that people were bad around him in any particular way, but there was a holding of space that he wasn't getting. And I
Sure.
think in having that his own way, he followed the pipeline to be like, okay, I'm going to do it to others. Childhood trauma might as well set me up for being a helper. So,
Yeah, I love that. And thanks so much for sharing. I'm just reflecting on kind of my own history because when I was 10, 11, 12, I really wanted to be a doctor. Like it was
mm,
a very important thing to me that I helped people.
yeah,
Um, and hearing your story, I'm reflecting, being like, oh yeah, I feel that as like, yeah, there wasn't anything bad or wrong in my life, but also I wasn't as undiagnosed ADHD at that point. So there were things
mm,
going on that were under the radar that nobody was harming me, but nobody was making extra space for me. So yeah,
definitely.
fascinating.
Yeah. That really resonates as well. I mean, it's also interesting too, right? How as you go through your story, there are all these different refinements. And I think that in my own story, I experienced a lot of chapters of like, is this actually what I want to do? Is this actually how I want to show up in the world? And then experiencing that confluence of the conversation or the person or the book or the resource in some way, just like nudging me a little bit. And yeah, just being willing to follow that.
Yeah. So were you psych undergrad and then grad school, or was that a bit of a windy journey as well?
Yeah, so for me, when I was doing undergrad, I actually did my undergrad in communication studies. I was really fascinated by the overlay of just language and culture and sociology, as well
Mhm.
as just the nuances of language, how sentence structure gets built in a very particular way, the cadence in which we tell stories, public speaking, these different fields in that respect. And I decided to do that because I think I wasn't 100% confident and sure that I was going to go for my master's degree. And I felt like if I did psychology, I was, committed to that route. And
Yeah.
there's something about my personality that has an internal rebel to it where I don't want to feel locked in. And that's where that degree kind of came into place. So,
Yeah. Yeah, if you get a bachelor's in psychology, it is assumed you are going to grad school or
Yeah,
working a very low income job.
exactly.
Um, so, knowing now at this point in your career, some of the specialties you work with religious trauma, which is how you and I connected in the first place, but also
Mhm,
trauma in general, do some
mhm,
EMDR, do some parts work, like all these trauma related things.
mhm.
What was that like being in the fields? Was that grad school, an internship placement? You saw a lot of trauma, you knew you wanted to work with it, or was that something that came later as you were like, oh, I'm seeing all these clients? Where'd
Mhm.
kind of the trauma piece start to come into it for you professionally?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, when I first got into the field, there a lot of the settings that I was in were very trauma-based, working at a suicide hotline, working at wraparound care. Um, but a lot of my experience of those places was, almost like taking somebody that was drowning and like trying to lift them up a little bit. And I really wanted to be able to work with people that were experiencing trauma in a way that I could actually, get them out of the drowning position in that perspective.
Hmm.
Prior to being a therapist, I was working in higher education and I worked with a lot of veterans. And so I think there's this slow building thing of just seeing people in constant crisis where you're like, I'm good at this. I like this. I value how these people are showing up and the questions that they're asking in that way. And then when I started private practice, it's kind of been an evolution into that, starting mainly with working with men and like codependency and boundary concerns, and then that evolving from there into religious trauma and attachment style work and some of these what I would consider like depth oriented approaches, because there's a subtlety in those approaches that I deeply value,
Hmm.
and really resonates with my own nervous system too.
Sure. And I love talking to other private practice owners because my experience was I put that off too long,
Yeah.
and I was scared of the business side of it because my experience in grad school was no business education. There was no aspect of if you go into private practice. It was all agency work based, and
Mm.
um, so I'm curious too. What was that kind of that side of the profession? What was that journey like for you to go from working in these different places to then owning your own practice?
Yeah, so for me, I think in graduate school, I definitely knew that I wanted to do private practice at some point. I don't think I had a timeline for that. I don't think I was like, "Oh, I'm gonna finish grad school and jump immediately into private practice." The thing that kinda happened for me, though, was as I was working in these different settings, I felt like there were certain skills that I wasn't getting that I really wanted to be honing, and a lot of those were things that were associated with long-term care. Um, and I was specifically working at this suicide hotline, and I did this in such a way where I was like, "Okay, I'm going to do this work. I'm going to do it for another year and a half to 2 years, and just pound my hours out and do a very small time private practice on the side." And while I valued the work that I was getting at the suicide hotline, there was something that was in me at that moment of this is not my path. This is not the journey that I want to be working on. And so I had a tiny bit of savings and a few clients in my private practice. And I was just like, I'm going to make this work. And I quit the job and just hustled my butt off for 3 months to really get that private practice, like not just up and running, but thriving in that way. And that was like 7 or 8 years ago. And it's cool to just see the evolution of those things. It was really an act of, I think, believing that I had a certain vision that I wanted to execute and being willing to follow that and just kind of learning as you went along.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a fascinating part of being an adult, realizing that nobody actually knows what they're doing and you just kind of have to do it and
Yeah,
adjust accordingly.
exactly.
Uh, uh, so some of the things that you specialize in, I mean, that's extra training, that's additional focus that you as a practitioner have to do to be able to provide those services. Was that a desire from Suicide Hotline, working with veterans, having seen that trauma where you're like, I need to be trained in this more? Was that a slow trickle, accumulating things, certifications, workshops here and there? What did
Yeah.
that look like?
Yeah, I think for me that was just this genuine process of discovery. So when I was first kind of starting off in private practice, I found myself already being kind of drawn to attachment research. There was something about that that deeply resonated with me. The model I was studying at that time was emotionally focused therapy, and doing some couples work and doing individual work and studying and getting supervision for that, and kind of really trying to be as robust as I could in those offerings. And then, as clients came into my practice, finding the things that worked and the other things that just didn't seem to resonate, that they resonated in the training or they resonated in maybe my own system, but they didn't resonate for those clients. And I could feel these moments where we were approaching trauma, or we were approaching kind of these like not just moments of catharsis, but like moments of transformation, but like not actually getting at that energy. And as a profoundly curious human, then I start going into, well, how do we actually reach those? In what ways are we not able to jump in the ways that we want? And that's where the evolution kind of came from. So starting with some EMDR training and really seeing how that began to offer and move things for people in very particular ways. And then I had this really crystal clear moment where I was about to dive really deep into EFT and letting that be like my primary modality. And right as I was about to go do that training, the pandemic hit, and just everything got closed off, and there wasn't those same robust offerings that I was wanting to go after.
Sure.
And then in that time, in that space of trying to figure out what's the next chapter of this journey, somatic experiencing came out of that, and just really getting a lot of space and a lot of permission to enter deeply into how to listen to the nervous system, and finding this inner winding between nervous system regulation and the use of EMDR. And it just opened up this whole new world for me. And I started to really see a lot of change in clients that felt inaccessible before. And then parts work kind of came along in that too. And it's kind of been the ongoing process of consistently getting refinement in those areas.
Yeah, I love talking to private practice owners. I also love talking to therapists who've been in the field for a minute. Um, there's some joy and wonder in talking to new recent graduates, but
Yeah,
also
totally.
um, for the people who've been in the field 10, 15 years, like most of us have this experience of what I started out focusing on, I still work with, but I've added this piece or I do it differently now. Because I
Hmm.
think reflective to our clients, they're coming to see us and learn and grow, but we grow with them. And so when you do the work for many years, it changes how you approach the work. I think if you're doing it well, anyways,
Hmm.
that locking in on modality is not what most therapists end up doing. We just accumulate
Yeah.
more and more ways to help people.
Exactly. And I mean, I think that, I don't know about you, but in my grad school training, there was a lot of um, warning about being too eclectic and just trying to kind of throw things together. And
Hmm.
so for me, one of the things that has been, I think, really, really important as I've consistently done private practice work is, how do each of these modalities, you know, complete the pie, or offer a very particular space that I'm not just randomly throwing them together, but each of these are um, offering a different layer that is super helpful and super thoughtful in that way. And that sense of integrity has felt kind of really important to me as I've continued in that.
Yeah. And I think the awareness that not everyone needs help in the same way. And I
Yeah.
think grad school offered a very idealistic view of you're going to have pages and pages of referral sources, and that's
Yeah.
not the case. At least I'm in the Midwest. That's not the case for me, where I can
Hmm.
say, "Oh, I don't work with that. Here's a great referral. They have
Totally.
openings. They are this much, or take insurance, or whatever." Where it's like, right, like
Hmm.
I'm gonna work with you because you know me and you're coming to me for this thing, and I'm gonna try and meet you on these different various things, especially doing like couples work. There's a lot in the room with you at one point,
Yeah.
and having multiple modalities that you can comfortably work in with people is
Hmm.
necessary. Whereas,
Yeah.
right, my grad school was also pick your modality and get really good at it, as
Yeah.
opposed to different people need different things.
Totally. Do you, and I guess like this has been part of my experience, and I don't know if this is also fits yours, is there's different chapters, like there are chapters in my private practice where I have loved couples work, and that has been the thing that I'm diving deep into. And there's a particular way of, for example, approaching that work that feels meaningful. And I've found as private practice, just as that consistently evolves, you have to stay cued into, am I still in that chapter? Because at certain points, like right now, for example, I don't do couples therapy because it doesn't resonate with me in that way. And that's felt, I don't know, for myself, like a really important piece as you're evolving.
Yeah, I can look back and say there were chapters. I don't know that I was always aware in the moment.
Yeah.
Um, but also I would say I'm neurodivergent with my ADHD. Having a big mix of cases is important to me.
Yeah. Totally.
Um, Switching to private practice and learning how to market was really hard for me because everyone said market your niche, and I was like, I have 4 of them that are totally unrelated.
Yeah.
Um, and so not grad school saying pick your modality, but then marketing kind of saying pick your thing that you're marketing. Those
Mhm.
things never super resonated in my brain. So I
Mm.
always have a mix of things that I like to do, but definitely I've had chapters where I'm coaching more. I did sports performance, leaving the church and then going back and getting certified to work with religious trauma, obviously, is my
Mhm.
most recent chapter. But yeah, like definitely things. It's always a mix of, I would say, 2 to 4 things for me with my ADHD that I'm kind of balancing. My
Yeah.
caseload is 30% of each of them or whatever it looks like.
I resonate with that in the sense that my brain consistently needs novelty in that way, which I think is a component of how my own ADHD shows up. Is like I need the novelty of like, oh, I haven't seen this puzzle in this way before, and what's this
Yeah.
thing that we're solving together or making space
Yeah.
for?
And I used to feel really bad saying like if I have the same case over and over, I will get bored. It's like it,
Yeah.
but but it's not a judgment on my clients in any way, shape, or form. It's acknowledgement of like this is the way my brain works. So if I'm going to be helpful to people, and I still do this, I still kind of jigsaw piece my calendar together where I don't have too many, let's say, couples cases back to back and on a daily basis, or too many religious trauma cases back to back, where I
Yeah.
have different things throughout the day so that my brain stays kind of nimble, I guess is the word that comes to mind. It's not like
Mhm.
I forget how to do therapy, but my brain just it's more attuned in a different way when I've got that mixture.
Yeah, I think I'd also be kind of curious if that was something like how you kind of got to that place, because I've also found that for myself, right? Of like for my own nervous system, I like to have 2 clients and then I want like an hour break between those. Like there's a reset piece that I really need, and it's taken my own time to develop that. Of like how do I listen to that?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, that's a good question. It's been a journey. I pre-kid, before I had children,
Hmm.
um, I worked across the street from a gym, and I would see a couple clients in the morning. I'd go to the gym for 3 hours.
Wow.
Um, and then I would come back and see clients in the afternoon and evening. And I think I fell into that. That was certainly not intentional. That was first
Hmm.
job out of grad school.
Right.
Um, and so that was, but like I think that to me let me know like yeah, there's a part that I play in how I show up for my clients and like how I invest
Hmm.
in myself, how I take care of myself, movement throughout the day. I would go to the gym and play volleyball because there were pickup volleyball games, and so like that really helped me stay sharp, I felt like, and I was aware was my self-care. So that
Yeah.
was kind of ingrained from my first job. It's looked
Mm.
different everywhere I've worked, and I still am tinkering with it in private practice because it's perhaps less of I have more flexibility, but also I don't know. I'm still tinkering with it in private practice, to be honest. But that awareness of like, right, my body needs to move at some point, and my
Hmm.
brain kind of needs that uh, flush, that reset. I don't know. Those both those words sound too strong in my head, but like
Sure.
something.
Yeah, I get
Me-
that. I mean, yeah. I feel like I want to almost dispel the myth that we're ever done tinkering, right? Like
yeah, that's true.
you know, that like I think that there's been this thing for me as my own career has evolved is hearing from other therapists, oh, the sensitivity, like eventually that won't bother you anymore. Eventually you'll get over that. And for me, and I guess that this is also an important piece of why I moved away from certain jobs earlier in my career to private practice was I love that sensitivity about myself. I love that, you know, when clients tell me stories or when things happen in that way, there is a resonance that carries through my life in that. And I might not be consciously thinking about or worrying about or anxious about that, but there's this piece of like, okay, I'm supporting this client in this way. How does that also impact the rest of my life and the way that I show up in my self-care and my own relationships too?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think private practice has been nice because I structure self-care a lot differently. Like, I don't see
Mm,
clients on Wednesdays. We're recording on a Wednesday. Like, that's always
yeah.
my client free day, whether it's doing media, whether it's going out on the river, going disc golfing, going to
Hmm.
the zoo with my youngest child who's not in school yet, like whatever. Like, it's a totally
Yeah.
open day for me. If I need to catch up on notes, which just comes up a lot with my ADHD, like,
Yeah.
but whatever, I've got that free day every single week. Occasionally I'll see a client here or there on a Wednesday, but like it's always my choice. It's always, so that's been really nice to have 2 days on, day off, 2 days on, weekend. Like, that has
Really.
been really wonderful for me personally and
Mm,
how I set my schedule, um, and working less, just
absolutely. It's
fewer
great to
hours.
get to that place, right, where you're not having to do the exact same schedule every single day, that you get that sense of freedom there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say to young therapists, like going into private practice, you work fewer hours and you make more money, like sooner rather than later in your career. It's a good shift
Mhm.
to make.
Agreed.
Um, I'm gonna do a hard pivot here.
Sure.
What's your
I'm ready.
background in religion? Where'd the religious trauma piece come in? You're on the West Coast, so I'm always like
Mhm.
I'm connecting to both coasts. I'm in
Yeah.
Milwaukee, Wisconsin, like the only religious trauma therapist in the state. So I'm always curious, like, how'd you get into that? Is it a personal journey on your end? Was it a professional thing? What's the background there?
Yeah, I mean, so I grew up in a really deeply religious household. I was actually born and raised in Minnesota, so, you know, not
Okay.
super far from you in that way. I grew up in like a Lutheran model, so like that was a lot of my upbringing and a lot of you know, the traditional pews, pastor, like, you know, stand up, sit down, that experience.
Yeah.
Um, and then my journey through religion, you know, led me all the way to the place of moving to California and being part of a non-denominational church. So I've kind of done the gambit in terms of those experiences. I would say that, I mean, for myself, my journey of working with religious trauma also comes out of a lived experience too, of um, being turned away from a church or kicked out of a church, and seeing like um, how I approached therapy in that way, and not having therapists that maybe knew how to hold or knew what I was really looking for in that respect, and doing their best, but not really hitting on the core of what I think my own needs were, and taking that sensitivity and that lived experience and also the trainings that I've had, and interweaving that into my own practice and supporting the people that show up in my own story.
Yeah. Let's nerd out about Lutherans because I was
Let's
raised
do this.
Lutheran. What
Yeah,
what brand what brand of Lutheran were you?
Missouri Senate.
Okay. I grew up
Yeah.
Wells, so
Ah, okay.
the most conservative version.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I've talked about this in other podcast episodes, but like undiagnosed ADHD, because in my brand of Christianity, we didn't do mental health.
Right.
Um, and, you know, it was a spiritual battle thing. It wasn't a medical
Yep.
condition. Both my parents are educators, very, very intelligent people, but like just
Mm.
that block through the religion of like, Jeremy's up every minute and sharpening his pencils and emptying,
Mhm.
you know, the chalkboard tray and has all this extra stuff, but he's getting good grades, so he must be
Yep.
fine. And so I look back on like again, like my religious trauma, I talk about little t trauma for myself, like nothing major, no big PTSD, but like hell trauma, very black and white
Mhm.
thinking, like a lot of that stuff that as I moved more liberal, similar kind of thing where you're finding non-denominational and trying to find
Yeah.
things that fit better for you until finally leaving the church altogether and being like, right, this just is not a thing that fits for me, that I don't
Mhm.
ascribe to anymore. Um, but that definitely, looking back on my professional work, like that has been there in the chapters that we were talking about earlier of like my work
Mhm.
of like, oh yeah, this is where I was like, right, I need to support my marginalized clients in a significantly different way than I am. I don't know what that's like because I grew up white male in a Christian environment, so like super privileged. So what does that look like? How do I approach this differently? What do I need to deconstruct? What do I need to learn? And I can look at those chapters very clearly in my career. It's like, oh yeah, I was trying to leave the church. I didn't know
Mm.
that yet, but that's what was happening. And then
Yeah.
like a lot of that was through the work that I had through even in undergrad, like just the science I was exposed to all of a sudden after being parochial school K through 12,
Mm.
like, oh,
Yeah.
science and research, what a novelty. Um, so yeah, like that high control religion impacted for sure the work that I was doing early in my career.
Definitely. I mean, I think I see that same experience for myself too. Like a lot of when I was starting doing work in private practice was working with elements of codependency and seeing a lot of men show up in that, and then ended up working with a lot of gay men. And then as you're doing those experiences, um, it was really interesting how certain clients just find you, and there's that religion background that starts coming up, and it starts connecting a lot of the dots for you of oh, I've lived this, and I've thought I've held that story in a particular way, but as this client's talking about their own story and I'm really tracking my own system too, oof, there's still things here, and how do I kind of like reach in that and work with that and carve that out.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's so much intersectionality that goes into that, right? So like I can talk about
Totally.
white privilege and male privilege, but like being neurodivergent, it's not a privileged status in our society, and definitely not in the
Mhm.
early 2000s.
Mhm.
So even just the way that I relate to my own diagnosis changed as I moved further and further away from the church. And that's really informed how I work with clients too, of like, oh, it's not just this diagnosis in a vacuum, it's your values and your belief system making sense of this diagnosis.
Totally. I mean, I also really value that piece of um, just neurobiology, right? That, like, as we are talking about these things, we're talking about things that are set up as certain structures within us, right? And there's often, at least in my own experience, the downplaying of those structures within religious systems, right? Because it doesn't fit the mold, and there's not a sense of full understanding of that. And I think even just the psychoeducation piece for clients of like, no, your brain is set up in this way. How do we work with that? How do we find this line to play within that? And there's always just that aha moment when those labels get to fall off.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm so fascinated with the somatic experiencing because my upbringing with religion and a lot of my clients that I work with who are coming out of high control religion, it's a theme to disconnect from your body. Your body is sinful, your body is broken, your body is, of the
Yeah.
world, whatever religious word gets thrown on it. But like you're
Mhm.
taught from a young age for a lot of people to ignore or to like second guess your body. And so
Totally.
something like somatic experiencing where you're like creating space and getting in touch with your body in a way, I can
Mhm.
see how that's such a powerful tool for clients coming out of high control religion.
I would totally agree with that. I mean, I would say that part of how I've been exposed to deconstruction work is a lot of deconstruction work will look at how have you thought about things, and how do we change not just those thought patterns, but the perspective of things. And for me, some of the most powerful deconstruction work I've done has been bottom up. It's been that experience of my mind knows these differences, but like you're saying, my body hasn't really caught on to that same experience. And that's where I so value that religious trauma, both work and the pieces of that is clients who come to me where they're like, I have been out of religion for 10 years, 15 years, 25 years, and I know and think about the world in this way. I trust that I do, but there are ways that my body inherently responds to that that I can't seem to get over. And that nuance, I mean, that's my bread and butter, the thing that I love sinking my teeth into, because there is such a subtlety that comes alive in it. And like you were saying, those messages of being taught that the body's evil or the body's sinful or that we are bad in some sort of way cuts us off from some beautiful resources that the body wants to offer us. And getting to see clients like retap into those resources, and those resources like naturally expand, I mean, that is one of the beautiful processes that takes place in therapy.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's I think it can be exponential growth for some people, and I think sometimes it's almost this like tiered plateau,
For sure.
another different plateau, because some of this stuff can, I don't want to use like black and white thinking. Um, so take with a grain of salt what I'm about to say, but like
Yeah.
I'm gonna say can only be reached when you have certain levels of safety. So like when you're working with
Mhm.
something like complex PTSD,
Yep.
it's unsafe to feel your body. So you can't, as a therapist, we can't just go in and be like, well,
Yep.
let's do this thing. I do DBT a lot with my clients. So like we're gonna do you know, a grounding technique for some clients, like they need the intellectual piece first. That's like
Yep.
one plateau. And then we're gonna do
Agreed.
some other work to get to a place where we can reconnect to our body. And some
Hmm.
clients it's exponential, right? That one thing opens, one domino falls and they all fall. So I think it's
Yeah.
interesting too, just the nuance of like each person, this process can look so different for people based on their own lived experience.
100%. And I mean, I love the piece that you said about safety too, because I think that there is this element where we can look at safety and we are holding it through, you know, what are the body gestures, or like what is the tone of conversation, or these different things, and getting to teach and see clients really embody safety, find and discover safety that is based there. And then how thinking changes in that, and how things really unfold. That it's like, um, cool, we seem like we are sitting in this non-threatening space, but are you safe or are you disassociated? And like, how do
Mhm.
we pay attention to those nuances in that way? Um, that's something that feels very up and important.
Yeah, and how they can feel safe and connected through some of the work, and then one trigger gets tripped up, and all of a sudden they're not safe. And like that's usually not a cognitive process. That's not something they're aware of. And so things like spiritual bypassing and some of that stuff comes up where it's like, oh, you've learned to intellectualize this feeling, so you're so disconnected from it that you're not
Yes.
even aware that's a trigger. You're
Mhm.
not even feeling that process happen.
Yeah, and I like also the piece that you said, that it is not just one way, right? There is also that cognitive element that comes in too. That um, when a client is, for example, leaning too heavily on the somatics, it can be, I just need to meditate more. I just need to do X, Y, or Z more, and not recognizing how those structures are also based in the distortions that are coming from religious trauma, right? And that like the unpacking of that needs to be a both and experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I like to remind clients the body is an organ just like your kidneys, and
Yeah.
or the body. The brain is an organ just like your kidneys. And so like we don't think really hard and our kidneys work better. We can't think really hard and our brain's gonna work better. But
Yeah.
I do think because a lot of people in high control religion have that spiritual bypassing and some of that black and white thinking ingrained, that like there is some intellectual work to do. And again,
Mhm.
for different people, it's starting there. For different people, it's bringing it in on the back end, right in the middle, wherever it fits for them. But it's one of those things where, like, my experience with clients is it's very much a both and. And I would say my own personal experience, I did all the
Mhm.
intellectual work first,
Totally.
and then was like, oh shit, I got a bunch of body stuff that I need to do. That was like for me, my ADHD diagnosis hit differently because I didn't
Mhm.
notice my sensory issues as much because I was just bypassing them, and I had
Yeah.
no that wasn't a cognitive thing I was doing. I've just been doing it since I was a little kid. So like one of those things where it's like, oh shit, like this is a whole new thing for me. Like I got a new therapist who does totally different work because I
Yeah.
needed a different experience of like, I don't know. I know how to work with this theoretically, but I don't know how to put it into practice. And so
Yes.
needing to do like my work differently, getting a different therapist, like,
Mhm.
and I know that stuff as a therapist that was good, but like helping clients through this process of like it's growth, it's progress. Because a lot of times they're like, oh no, another thing, but it's like, no, this is good. They're like, it feels awful though. It's like, right, but like it is a good sign of progress that like you're unlocking this thing that's been shut off, or you're connecting to this thing that you
Absolutely.
haven't been able to get in touch with.
Yeah, and I mean, I love that piece that you said of also finding different therapists for different focuses, right? That like unpacking the puzzle of religious trauma or healing in that way is not just based in one modality or one therapist. I mean, some of the best quote unquote ways that I have grown or healed elements of my own religious trauma is having a really diverse care team. You know, sometimes that's therapy, other times that's massage therapy, sometimes that's acupuncture. Like each one of these modalities has brought their own unique tools in that way that kind of are healing across the spectrum.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I love my therapist. Shout out to Melissa. She's episode 1 of my podcast. But like, I'll joke too. She talks about crystals. She's trained in Reiki, like all this stuff that I, as a therapist, I'm like, no, 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 that's junk science. Let's not do
Mhm.
that. But I needed somebody who approached it totally different than I did, because
Yeah.
otherwise I was going to intellectualize it.
Mhm.
And I needed somebody who had like a body perspective different than my own, who wasn't coming out of purity culture, who wasn't raised in the same stuff,
Yeah.
where she was comfortable pushing me on some things that I was smart enough to intellectualize my way out of with other therapists. And so, um, again, I think it's having a good care team, whether that's advocating for yourself and finding a new therapist, or finding a therapist who has that special training that you're looking for. Like that's such a big deal for people.
Yeah, and I think it's also in that too, right? That like you need multiple people, right? Like I think sometimes with religious trauma, there's this element of people wanting to lean into community, but at the same time being scared of community because of what's happened within those communal settings. And I think part of that healing process can often be, cool, I am your therapist. I provide these levels of resources for you, but like let's also admit that there are inherent limitations within what we're offering. And if I'm trying to be everything, you're missing out on some very valuable, like just even social connections within that. And how do I encourage those things too?
Yeah. Yeah. And community is huge with religious trauma. Like I would say it's the number one thing I hear from people leaving religion they're scared to lose is the community,
Yeah.
because in-group out-group dynamics in churches are very strong. And so when you're in group,
Right.
you're in the community full force. And so it's very bizarre, I think, for people, especially if they're raised into the religion, to imagine a world that exists outside of that.
Oh, for
Um,
sure.
but it's so great. One of the things with high control religion is that information control. Looking at Steve Hassan's bite
Hmm.
model of like information
Yep.
control, not knowing, hey, there's 1,000 deconstruction podcasts out there. Hey,
Yeah.
there's all these Facebook groups, there's meetups, there's stuff in person, there's a ton of virtual stuff. Like when you're in the church, you are aware of zero of that. And so it
Absolutely.
seems really scary to leave the set community to like think there's nothing out there. You just don't
Yeah.
know it.
Well, and I think that's also that nervous system component too, that when you leave or you're asked to leave in a church, like that shatters a lot of the internal models that you have. And how do you again find safety in that, right? Like maybe you spend 5 or 6 months listening to a whole bunch of different podcasts so that some puzzle pieces get put back into place there before you ever show up to any sort of group or event or
Mhm.
things like that. And I think one of the things that I've really discovered in my religious trauma groups is it's a place for people to just rediscover that the world might hold a little bit more safety than what they've been taught.
Yeah. Yeah. And right. I love the Facebook groups for that too. Just like normalizing, like
Hmm.
there's such a alienation internally that goes on of like, I'm the only person who's ever done this. And like,
Hmm.
join a Facebook group of deconversion, and like everyone's got the same story. It looks different. The specifics are different, but like
Yep.
that internal dialogue, that questioning, that like
Hmm.
existential crisis, like, right, that's very normal part of the process for people.
Absolutely. And I think also just taking the feelings too and basing, for me, I find that clients get a lot of value when I'm also basing those within neurobiology components, right? Like if we're
Hmm.
talking about the different circuits of the brain and we talk about the seeking circuit or the reaching circuit or the trust circuit, and they start to conceptualize, oh, when I am feeling this thing, it is a particular circuit within inside of me. I'm not just like mentalizing this in a certain way, then those steps also become easier of wanting to potentially connect to resources of how do I ground myself and how do I move in that process and how do I give myself a lot of space as I maybe show up for a group and then I'm exhausted for 2 days afterwards because there's a lot of information that I need to integrate from that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I talk about that a lot with clients. I give them a heads up. You're going to be tired after therapy. Don't plan
Yeah.
anything.
Yep.
Um, you talk specifically. One of the things I don't know that I've covered in the podcast is kind of the injury that happens with being asked to leave or being removed from a church, and that's
Yeah.
very. I use the word injury. Like I would say that's another level of, it's not just passive accumulation of little T traumas. That's a potentially big T PTSD type trauma.
Agreed. Yeah. I think that's something that a lot of clients also seek me out for too. And whether that's coming from an LGBTQ perspective or that's coming from someone that just no longer agrees with the religion and then gets kicked out or found out in very particular ways. There's a lot of danger that gets digested in the nervous system about themselves and how they show up and their personal identity, as well as the relationships in their lives. Like, just even being able to trust someone again after being asked to leave when you've been considered that these people are my family or the people that are going to be invested in me no matter what. A lot of churches talk about, like, just keep showing up or just keep being present in this different way. And if you get cut off from that, holy moly, that throws a lot of models out of whack for you. And people just come to therapy with like knowing that that's a thing, but having no idea how to pick up the pieces of their lives after that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's so much safety that goes into that of like you've been taught and it's been rewarded over and over again that church is safe. And then when that becomes an unsafe environment, like there's so much stuff in your brain that's wired to handle it one way. And then you have this
Mhm.
reality, this abrupt reality check of like, oh, that's not safe for me anymore.
Yeah, and I mean, I think also one of the things that I've discovered in some of the clients that I see is an internal knowing that even though that church was being said they're safe or they're comforting or they're family, there was a sense inside of them that they could track that that didn't feel genuine to them, and they went along with it anyways. And there's then this component of self betrayal or self trust that goes offline, and working with that of like how do you begin to build self trust in yourself again, how do you begin to like, oh my gosh, I like you as a person, or you're really cool in that way. Wait, can I actually trust these feelings and sensations that are coming forth?
Mhm.
I mean, that bouncing back and forth process is really difficult for people. Really, really difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would add, for some people, it's not relearning how to do that. Some people, it's learning how to do it in the first place because they were indoctrinated into it and don't actually have an idea of what true safety feels like.
Agreed. And also just those social skills, like a lot of times when you're in a high control group, the only thing that you're encouraged to do is to deal and hang out with those members, right? So there's
Mhm.
there's ways that we spend time in fun, there's ways that we have adventure, there's ways that we, navigate the holidays. And then if you lose that, oh my gosh, there's this diversity element that we don't know how to work with. How do I actually have a conversation that's not just asking the same 25 questions that are a part of that? How do I get to tune into my curiosity of the things that I actually want to know about you rather than how's your week been, Bill? And what's going on with the dog and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Some Minnesota nice kicks in there, I feel.
Of course.
I'm having a reaction of like, well, yeah, that's how we do things in the Midwest.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, the again, I tend to say like I don't think church does community particularly well. I
Hmm.
think it's just such a structured thing for people. They don't have to think about it. So like, right,
Yeah.
as a teen, if you're growing up in that high control bubble, like you go to youth group, X number of days. You've got evening worship, you've got weekend worship, you've got praise band or whatever. You're on sports teams through your school that's connected to your church. Like
Mhm.
so much of that stuff is prepared for you that like, right, it's not learning social skills. It's not approaching it from a skill or a technique approach. It's just done for you. Here it is on a platter. And so when you lose that, it's like, oh, you might be in your 30s and needing to learn how to do some of this for the first time.
Yeah, and really normalizing that, right? That like
Mhm.
the helplessness or the overwhelm or the uncertainty that you feel as you're trying to find new people to connect to or find how to actually pursue your interest and that sense of like I don't know how else to frame this. Like sometimes clients asking like, am I crazy? Right? Like, am I actually on this path in this way? And just really normalizing that sense of uncertainty and doubt is also part of being human, that
Yeah.
you're trying to figure out how to navigate this to the best of your ability.
Yeah. Yeah. And that permission giving to like try something and not like it, or to try something that I talk about permission giving a lot. Like
Yeah.
you get to give yourself permission now. It's not coming from anyone else. It's not coming
Right.
from anywhere else. It's you.
Mm,
Give yourself permission. Um,
yeah.
in prepping to talk to you, looking at your website, and one of the things I want to talk about is you offer intensive sessions. So um, you can correct the format here, but it looks like 4-hour sessions
Hmm. Yep.
with a
That's right.
45-minute phone call ahead of time and a 45-minute follow-up. Is that
Hmm. Yep.
accurate?
That's
Um,
accurate.
I love that because one of my big criticisms of grad school is we watched the greats, the Carl Whitakers, the Carl
Hmm.
Rogers, the great therapists that we learned their style of therapy. That's how they did therapy.
Right.
They would have a weekend where this family flies in, they're going to record it. It's the
Hmm.
1950s, everybody's chain smoking, and they would have these like marathon sessions. And as a grad student, I was just like, but I can't do therapy that way. I won't get reimbursed, or I won't, like, no one's going to schedule that with me. Like, so what
Hmm.
good is seeing a 6-hour session when I can't do that? And so I love, like, here's like, yeah, cool. I'll just do it that way too. Like,
Yeah.
here's the intensive. So where did that idea come from? What's the feedback you get from clients on that stuff? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really came from my love of attachment work, actually. So, like, a lot of clients, we would consistently comment on like doing the 50-minute session or the 55-minute session, however you want to frame that. We were just dropping into something, or we were just getting to the good stuff in that way, and then having to pull back from that. And some clients giving feedback that hey, I would love to go deeper than with this. I would love to not feel that clock ticking down, that like, we're dropping a tiny bit of honey in the glass and like just seeing how that kind of fits with the rest of the week. And then also my own creativity. I wanted more time to really drop in with people in that way. Um, so it kind of came out of that. Also within the MDR community, too, intensives are part of that community, part of the model of how we talk about things. And so it's really evolved where I get a lot of people that are saying, I've been in therapy for years. I've been with my therapist for years. I've been talking about these 4 issues and struggling with these 4 issues. I know how to think about them. I do the CBT skill on myself all the time. And yet I'm still experiencing this anxiety, this depression, this other somatic sense that something's off. And really being able to dive into the deep end and just sit in the deep end with people and hold space in that way and see people really experience these would feel like transformative moments in that way. And I feel like as I've done this more, I've been how do I want to say this? I've been aware of that some people are always looking for the quick result. I don't think that it's necessarily the quick result, but I think there's something in our nervous systems that we get to trust where it's I've done this, I've found the titrated experience up to 50 minutes, and my system's asking for someone more and someone that will drop in with me in that way. And I love that. I love showing up with people in that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's fascinating. I love talking to therapists who are doing things not in that cookie cutter medical model. and
Yeah.
really coming up with ways to meet clients and what they need. I also think in the wellness space, that's what these weekend retreats are for people. That's what, offering yoga sessions in the morning, and then we're going to do a group intensive, and then we're going to do breath work, and then we're going to have a campfire or whatever, nature
Yeah.
walk, and some of the psychedelic stuff too, like the integration
Hmm.
work, like where people are approaching it as we're going to go really deep over these 3 days.
Yeah.
Like, I think that isn't for everyone, but I think there are people who certainly like are looking for that, or are going to respond to that better. So I wanted to highlight that because I think it's awesome that I saw that on your website and was like, my brain instantly started being like, okay, what does that look like for you? How are you going to start doing that in the future? Because that's
Yeah.
such a good idea.
Yeah. And I think the thing that I've been really surprised is that people are willing to show up in that. Like we often think, oh, because we're not doing insurance with that, or because it doesn't fit this very prescriptive medical model, will people show up for that? But people desperately want that healing, and healers that can actually hold that space in that way. I think one of the things that's been really cool as part of the intensives is here in Oregon, we've decriminalized a lot of psychedelic experiences too. And
Mhm.
one of the things that I've seen people doing as this has consistently evolved is doing an intensive and feeling like they have the skills for actually going into those other altered experiences, whether that's breath work or whether that's doing psychedelic work on some level,
Mhm.
because it really builds some internal capacity to navigate our inner landscape that feels nice.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm glad you touched on that because I'm doing my psychedelic integration specialty
Mm,
right now, working on it.
cool.
Wisconsin's nowhere close to legalizing.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, I'm asking you to speak for all Oregon
Mm.
residents here, represent your state. But what's the landscape been like? It's been psychedelics have been decriminalized for two years now.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think we're in a really cool position in the sense that a lot of the providers that have had to be underground for these things are coming above ground and providing just a wealth of knowledge of how to navigate these landscapes in a very ethical way,
Mhm.
that isn't just shooting at the hip, if you will. One of the
Yep.
things that's a little bit of a struggle within our state is in terms of how we structured the decriminalization of psychedelics is we have a program that people go through in order to get certified in that, and then service centers that those providers have to work in. So
Sorry.
we have a wealth of people that have gone through the certification process to be a certified provider, but not enough service centers yet. And so that's one thing that Oregon's really working on to try and catch up on, and
Mhm.
really offer centers that can provide these healing spaces. But also just within Oregon, it's been cool to see all of the grassroots movements that have popped up. Like even here in Portland, there's an organization called the Portland Psychedelic Society. We have a few different societies that are based within therapeutic realms that are about offering knowledge and psychoeducation and integration services for people that are having these types of experiences, and really getting to see a network come together that feels really cool for where people go with it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. And in the religious trauma community, I think like a lot of clients are finding their way towards some version of plant-based medicine or a psychedelic experience or spirituality through a ritual or ceremony type setting. And so I think like for me, that was like, I need to learn more about this because my clients are saying, hey, can I do integration with you? Or I'm going X, Y, and Z. I'm going to be tripping. And when I get back, I want to talk about it. And I was like, okay, like that's
Yeah.
not legal, but also
Uh-huh.
let me tell you, like, here's what I know about it. And so I'm wanting to learn more about it because I think the federal government and the state governments are a little behind, but like people are finding their way to these things and interested in the healing properties of it. And so trying to, as a practitioner, be as up to date as I can be on this and meet my clients where they're at. Like that's been my big push for it. It's like, oh yeah, for a lot of my clients, they're already doing this stuff, whether I'm introducing it or saying it's okay or not. They don't really care. They're finding their way to it. So how can I help them and make sure they're being safe about it? So
I agree. Yeah, I think a lot of clients will also comment on just like even having a space to talk about those psychedelic experiences so that they don't
mhm.
feel marginalized in that way, that there is space to try and make meaning out of it, can be profoundly helpful. And we here in Oregon really, I think, value doing that.
Yeah.
How we hold space and how we welcome that in.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, it's been an
Yeah,
awesome chat.
yeah.
David, if people want to learn more about you, people want to check out your work, if they want to work with you, where do they go? Where do they find your stuff?
Yeah, you can just head over to my website, naturalmindcounseling.com. I'm also on Instagram, Natural Mind Counseling on Instagram as well. And you can check me out on either one of those platforms. I'm also on a platform for meditation called Insight Timer. And I have a few different meditations that are for people that are either struggling with trauma related things or wanting to just find more safety for themselves too. So you can also check me out there.
Very cool. We will have links to all of that stuff in the show notes so that it's easy for people to find. David, thanks so much for joining me this week.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's been great. And I really valued the conversation and all the twists and turns that we took in that too.
Yeah, that's my MO. And to all our lovely listeners, thanks for tuning in again this week. We'll be back next week with another new episode. Take care, everyone.